Right now, I'm going to welcome Mary O'Connell, our 3PL expert, author and host of Check All, I believe, here on FreightWaves. What's on your mind there, Mary? Welcome to the show.
Hey guys, glad to be on the show today. Things are going in the 3PL world. We last time we talked about the container chassis shortage, and this week on Check Call, we're actually going to break down FreightWave's very own research study, the broker compensation white paper that we have. So today we have Joe Antichak on the show, and we kind of break down some of the unique things that we found in the broker compensations guide, and then kind of did some casual speculation on why some of the areas that typically have a higher cost of living have a lower base salary and a lower margin percent that individual brokers typically get.
Wow.
First things first, I love transparency. Like, salary transparency is something that I am so passionate about. I think that it's something that's very underrepresented and under talked about in most industries, but specifically in competition-driven industries, which freight brokerage is, right? If you're not working hard to make more money than the person sitting in the chair next to you, then you're not doing a good enough job. And that mindset is really ingrained in a lot of companies. So just speaking specifically to this white paper about compensation, how does this and other studies done around compensation really help to break down that stigma about talking about pay? Because we can't make more money and be compensated fairly for our work unless we talk about it, right?
Exactly. And that's something that we bring up. That was actually the very first question that I asked Joe was, how did you get, because they had over 250 respondents. I said, how did you get over 250 people to respond about pay? Because that's something that's typically very tight-lipped. It comes with, first it's anonymous, but also it comes with the ability to brag. And if anyone's met a freight broker, they just love a good humble brag about themselves.
Sure. So not so humble brag.
Especially coming off the 2 years of super inflated spot rates and people doubling or seeing increases of at least 18% from year over year pay. Like, that is not anything difficult to brag about. But I am fully there. Everyone should be discussing their pay, knowing what everyone's worth, because you don't know your worth. If you're undervalued, but you think you're paid correctly, then you gotta just know what everybody's at. But anyway, so we did kind of dive in, and they mostly focused on the compensation, like the financial compensation, nothing really diving into health benefits or gym benefits or anything like that. But it was just kind of interesting. And this was mostly there was entry-level management and then senior leadership as well. So it was kind of interesting to see, based off some of my brokerage history, kind of where ultimately the sky is the limit for your earning potentials for how hard you're willing to work. But it was interesting to see managers and senior leadership as well and their commission percentages. That's where it gets juicy.
Yeah, I mean, there's reasons for those type of things. Was the research on companies responding as to what they paid their employees, or strictly from the employees saying what they made?
I believe it was from employees saying what they made. It's kind of the like self-reporting. So obviously you got to take it with a grain of salt when it comes to people saying that, like, I got 20% commission and all of that. But it's the FreightWaves research team. They have they have their guidelines that they stay within to make sure the data stays good. But yeah, it was self-reported. But most of it's kind of hard to be like, this self-reporting is bad when other people are lining up saying the exact same thing. So it's kind of a corroboration among everyone. So.
Sure, it's just interesting because in brokerage, it's one of the only industries that, or sections of logistics. I've been in all the sections of logistics really over 34 years, but it's the only one really where there's almost an encouragement, if not gamification, of compensation in order to encourage that competition, right? So it's not odd for this broker to know exactly what that broker is making. In fact, it's encouraged so that you're fighting for that top dog position, so to speak, right?
Oh, absolutely, because that top dog position is the one most rewarded, getting called out in weekly meetings, getting called out on the sales floor for being the leader, the succeeder. And more oftentimes than not, most brokerages will end up promoting that high performer to a management position because, if they're really good at bringing in numbers, they must be really good at getting a team to bring in numbers. And sometimes that's a good idea and sometimes that's not, but it's just a matter of that personality.
Yeah. It's one of the rules of the Peter Principle. That doesn't always work.
So, Marian, let's talk a little bit about the compensation deviation and about how some of these results are showing that for folks in higher cost of living areas like downtown Chicago, in those areas that are big cities, and it costs a lot to live there, your margin percentage might actually be lower and your base salary might actually be lower. Was there any insight into why that is, or was it that just kind of an underlying trend?
So we actually did some casual speculation about that. So the area that had the lowest compensation, I believe, was like the mid-Atlantic. So it was like Chicago, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Ohio, just kind of like everything that kind of surrounds the lakes. And so I thought that was interesting that Chicago was in there. Being from the Midwest, I do know that Chicago is quite expensive to live in. It's not quite a New York City, but it's more than the average Midwestern city. Mm-hmm. So it was strange that their the entry level base salary was about $30,000 or $38,000, which to me is extremely low and definitely not something that you can sustain in the city of Chicago, mostly because you can't sustain that in the city of St. Louis. So you're definitely not going to be able to sustain that in Chicago. And their margin was 10%. But then they did have higher volumes than most of the other areas. So it's kind of interesting that they did get paid the least, but they did have some of the higher volumes. So it's kind of one of those where like, well, is the extra volume making up for it? And then why do they have higher volumes? Is it because Chicago is a transportation hub? Is it because there's so many logistics service providers and freight brokers in Chicago? That doesn't necessarily increase your volume, but I guess it does. And so we kind of speculate on that today on the show because it's interesting that you would think that if you have all this volume and you have all of these manufacturers, service providers, like all these potential customers just a stone's throw away, you would think that those margin percentages would be higher because there's some customers, excuse me, a little more readily available in Chicago versus like rural Illinois. So it's one of those where it's like, that's kind of suspicious and weird. And I don't know, that was the most surprising to me that a city that is quite expensive to live in has such a low base salary and margin percentage.
I've got to wonder if one of the reasonings for that is that you've got companies who are maybe headquartered in Chicago and based in Chicago or the Chicago Metro who are still really apt to let their employees work from home or maybe work from a satellite office that's outside of the actual city itself. And like they're reporting these base salaries from living outside the city, but it's coming into the white paper and the data is saying they're based in Chicago because that's just where that company's headquartered. Like I wonder, we'll have to talk to Kevin and Joe to figure out if that's been broken down at all. But I wonder if that could be a part of that as well.
I would think that would have something to do with it because I mean that would certainly lower your base salary percentage. If I'm living in a rural part, my base salary is pretty low, but it would ultimately affect the overall out of Chicago. I'm very curious about that as well. We didn't quite speculate that far. But I would be wondering about that as well.
I'm going to send Joe a Slack after this and ask him about that. We'll report back later.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there for certain. Thanks so much, Mary.
Yep, absolutely. And of course,
guys.
You can catch Check Call in the afternoons right here on FreightWaves TV and head over to freightwaves.com/newsletters to subscribe to her newsletter and all of our newsletters in the FreightWaves ecosystem as well. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back in just a few minutes.